All right, in this section, we're going to see how the Soviets tried to flex muscle, but ended up making a huge mistake. The Soviets decided to exert their muscle in Berlin. Now remember, Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone, so in order for the Western powers to get to their zones of occupation, they had to go through Eastern Germany. Feeling what they saw as American provocation, the Soviets closed off road and rail access into Berlin. Berliners were suddenly captive peoples. It's almost as if the Soviets were saying, look, you Western powers, United States, if you want to have the Marshall Plan, you do that, but we're taking Berlin. We captured it during the war. We lost 28 million people. It should be ours. In cutting off Berlin, Stalin threw down the gauntlet, but this was a huge mistake. The United States used this as a great humanitarian victory and a great propaganda victory as well. The blockade might have worked in the 19th century, or even in the early 20th century. But the United States and the Western nations now have jets that can carry thousands of tons of aid to fly into airports in Western Berlin. Each of those Allied occupation zones, the Western occupation zones, had airstrips. Planes from the US, Canada, Great Britain, South Africa, and even the Netherlands delivered over 278,000 flights containing 2.7 million tons of goods over the course of a little over a year. Now, you might think, wouldn't the Soviets see this as an act of aggression? If those planes have food and fuel, what's to stop them from having bombs and tanks and war material? Here's where the Americans had the advantage. Truman knew that the Soviets wouldn't shoot down the planes coming in, because the United States had something the Soviets didn't have: the bomb. So Truman ordered the go-ahead for the airlift until Stalin agreed to end the blockade in late 1949. After he ended the blockade, though, Stalin tightened Soviet control on East Berlin, stringing up barbed wire, establishing checkpoints, and limiting travel for East Berliners. He didn't build a wall. There wasn't a wall yet. There won't be one for a while. You probably know it's coming. And if you didn't know, well, now you know. The Berlin airlift was a huge humanitarian victory. How great does it look for the United States to control this air convoy, hundreds of flights a day, delivering coal, wheat, oil, potatoes, food, basically everything required for survival. The Berlin airlift also showed the American commitment to West Berliners, and was just one more reason that the leading European nations wanted a military alliance with the United States. Now, in the first half of the 20th century, let's step back for a second, the United States had allied itself with the United Kingdom and France for 2 world wars, but had never been involved in a permanent military alliance. The United States had made treaties and alliances, the first being with France during the American Revolution, but for the most part, the United States remained out of any permanent bonds, or what George Washington called the entangling alliances with Europe. Never before, though, had the United States been one of only 2 leading countries in the world. In April 1949, the UK, the US, France, Belgium, Canada, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Portugal founded the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as a counterweight to Soviet armies stationed in Central and Eastern Europe. There's sort of a Three Musketeers vibe with NATO. One for all for one. An attack on any of the members would be considered an attack on all of the members. Now, Stalin doesn't want that, because the United States had the bomb and the Soviets didn't. Until they did. Soviet spies, the Manhattan Project, and Soviet scientists developed an atomic weapon. In September 1949, American spy planes picked up evidence of a successful nuclear blast, and it wasn't from a Western nation. Containment had been predicated on the Soviet Union's lack of the bomb, and now they had it. This changed everything. The US lost its upper hand, and the Cold War was at a stalemate. More on that in a second. 1949 was also not a great year for the containment strategy in another way, not involving the Soviet Union, but involving China. After World War II ended, a civil war reignited in China. This was the civil war that had been going on in the 1930s when Japan invaded Manchuria and exploited the instability to take over China. The Chinese Civil War pitted the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, against the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong. Knowing this, and knowing how the United States intervened in the Greek Civil War, which pitted royalists against communists, how do you think the United States responded? Now, it would be logical to think that the US would come to the aid of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. However, the US really didn't do much to help him, and Mao Zedong's communists held most of the Chinese countryside and basically chased Chiang Kai-shek out of mainland China to the island of Formosa, which we know as Taiwan. Mao Zedong then took over as Chairman Mao, leader of the largest communist country in terms of population. And who's bordering China? Oh yeah, the Soviet Union. So that policy of containment didn't seem to be working, given that the biggest country in area and the biggest country in population were now both communist, and the Soviets had the atomic bomb. The fall of 1947 must have been a crazy time. If you're the US, you're probably thinking, this can't get worse. Panic is breaking out in the State Department. How do we contain communism now? Has this all been a failure? The US responded to the developments in China by refusing to recognize Mao as the legitimate ruler, and only recognized Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of China. Truman and everyone knows that Mao was basically running things, but the State Department essentially cut off all diplomatic ties to China, and now needs a new ally in Asia. Now this is where things get really weird. If you had told someone in 1945 that within 5 years the United States would ally itself with Japan, they would have sacked you right in the kisser. This was beneficial for both countries, since the US would get an ally, and Japan could get help rebuilding from the country that destroyed it. The US is also going to re-examine containment and think about how they should proceed moving forward. And that leads us to the final document of our packet, a report from the National Security Council. The Soviets have the bomb, China's gone communist, and the US has lost its edge. The Red Army is widespread around the world, especially across Eastern Europe. The Soviets have a massive military advantage, and now the bomb. And while China had gone the way of Marx, the Soviets saw China as a competitor, believe it or not, and didn't want to lose that position as the most important military power center in the communist world. So what will the Soviets do to keep their position? This was a key question for the authors of NSC 68. NSC 68 presented a very stark outlook for the American position versus the Soviet Union. This is a long quote. Bear with me. The Soviet Union is developing the military capacity to support its design for world domination. The Soviet Union actually possesses armed forces far in excess of those necessary to defend its national territory. These armed forces are probably not yet considered by the Soviet Union to be sufficient to initiate a war which would involve the United States. This excessive strength, coupled now with an atomic capability, provides the Soviet Union with a great coercive power for use in time of peace in furtherance of its objectives, and serves as a deterrent to the victims of its aggression from taking any action in opposition to its tactics which would risk war. NSC 68 recommended that in order to respond to the Soviet threat, the US and its allies have to have a large-scale buildup of military and general strength around the world. If the US was seen as the weaker opponent, then it would be at the threat of nuclear attack. It was only through a power balance that the US could make sure that it wasn't going to be attacked. The US and its allies have to catch up with the Soviets, but really they need to go beyond Soviet power. And it was no longer just national security that was important, but global security to protect the free world. NSC 68 was all about massive military buildup. Quote, "We have no choice but to demonstrate the superiority of the idea of freedom by its constructive application, and to attempt to change the world situation by means short of war, in such a way as to frustrate the Kremlin design and hasten the decay of the Soviet system." So as NSC 68 saw it, if the United States poured money into weapons, and that in turn led the Soviet Union to pour money into weapons, the Soviet Union would go bankrupt. In essence, NSC 68 provided the blueprint for the militarization of the Cold War from 1950 into the 1990s. And this is really the start of the arms race, and right in time for the Cold War to heat up. But I'm going to save that for the next part of the lecture.